So the Murray-Darling Basin system, most people would agree, I don't think many people would disagree, it is over-allocated. Now, over-allocated is a subjective term and the science is not complete, and obviously at the end of the day there will be a political decision to determine what that actually means. There's a paper by a guy called Gary Leibkap who you might find. So Gary's written some ballpark figures on what it means to have a reasonable system. Now, I'm not talking here about sort of back to the trees, back to caveman type stuff here. We're just simply saying that the current situation cannot go on. Now, on my campus there's a thing called the Murray-Darling Freshwater Research Centre. These are ecologists and chemists. To give you some indication of the problem, the pH of some of the billabongs and creeks that these guys work in varies between about 1 and 2. That's equivalent. That's like battery acid, and it's happened because of the sequence of dry years, but the preceding 100 years of irrigation and how we've changed that system. So these are very serious ecological problems that are going to have to be dealt with if it ever starts to rain again. Anyway. We do have, if we accept that there's over-allocation, the policy choices really fall into two sets. One is to go around and buy some of those rights back, and euphemistically that's referred to as buyback. And the second original thinking was that if we just somehow save water, if we're somehow better with our use of water, this will generate savings that can then be used to save the river. You know, words are everything, aren't they? We'll come back and talk about the second one in a moment, which is a particular problem I have. But because buyback is in the news, I thought it would be useful to give you some feel of what's happening with buyback. Now, from an economist's perspective, buyback makes sense. Remember? Because when it comes to allocating resources, markets will usually do a pretty good job. So if a government comes into a market and says, I'm standing here, I'm wanting to buy your water, the people who value it least will be the first to offer it. So the notion of buyback is that somebody sells their water right to somebody who wants it more, and both parties walk away happy. So the person having sold their right ends up with cash, which presumably is of greater value than what they have used in the transaction. The difficulty we have, though, with some of this stuff around buyback is that all sorts of people who really should know better have opinions on water, even if it's not particularly well informed. Now, you would have thought somebody like the ABC, for example, a relatively conservative institution, would know better than to refer to Cubby Station as a water-sucking device. You know, there are some problems with this. Now, it's not just the ABC, it's a generic problem with water. There is a limited understanding of water products and its measurement. So I'll just have a quick test for you. Who in the audience can visualise a kilolitre? What does a kilolitre look like? Put your hand up if you know what a kilolitre looks like. Right. So a kilolitre is about a metre by a metre by a metre. You've seen those... Sorry? Not about that. Exactly. Sorry, right, okay. 3 feet by 3... Does that help? You might have seen them riding on the back of utes. You know, they're those sort of plastic things with metal around them. That's about a kilolitre. Put your hand up if you know how many of those you would use in a year, roughly, if you're a normal household in Bendigo. Put your hand up if you know how much you use in a year. It's a bit scary, isn't it? So, you know, we've got probably 80, 90 people here, and, you know. The average house, it varies a bit, depends on whether you're on stage 4 restrictions, of course, but actually stage 4 restrictions don't make all that much difference. It just makes the institutions feel like they're doing something. But your average household in Albury-Wodonga, for example, would use about 300 kilolitres a year. 2 to 300, somewhere in that sort of mark. So what's a megalitre then? Right. Can you picture that in your head? Right. So usually the measurement for this sort of stuff when we start talking about basins is in gigalitres. Now this is where the politicians start to get a bit lost. So they start to invent their own metric, things like SIDARBs. You know what a SIDARB is? It's the water in the Sydney Harbour. You know. So they'll say, you know, there's SIDARBs. You know, there's 4 Sydney harbours in that buyback. You know, what does all that mean? So part of the problem is that even the metric's not particularly well understood, and because it's a relatively small proportion of your household disposable income, usually less than 1%. But really, it's not on the radar in terms of how much of it you use. And yet, many of you will race home and turn the shower off and make sure it's turned off when you're brushing your teeth. You know, we are literally talking about a scale problem here. To fix some of those acid wetlands requires a bit more than you putting in a water-saving shower head. You know, there is a big gap between a gigalitre and, half a kilolitre. So part of the problem, because people don't really understand this well, but they usually have very strong opinions. So taxi drivers usually have very strong opinions about whether somebody should have a sprinkler going or not. It becomes too easy for politicians and bureaucrats to pretend that they're doing something when they're really not. So what we have with Buyback at the moment, we have a few problems with it. One of the problems is that we're out there purportedly buying water. Some of it's glasses. There's no water, but we've got a few glasses and some of them are plastic cups with holes in them. So we're out there buying those things, but there's no plan just yet. So the Murray-Darling Basin Authority is working on a plan that purportedly will be delivered around 2011, and then it'll start to roll out. So it actually won't cover the whole basin in 2011. It'll gradually roll out. The difficulty is you're buying things, but you're not quite sure whether it's lining up with what you want it to do. This political opportunism is a problem too. If you've got a plan, at least you can rein in political opportunism. It's a bit hard without that plan. So, for example, we have the New South Wales government going and buying the supplementary water licence of Tandao Station. Now, supplementary water licences, these are licences that equate to water only in a very big flood. When was the last time you saw one of those? So the New South Wales government paid about $30 million for the supplementary water licence of Tandao Station. Tandao wasn't silly enough to sell its general security or high security water, it only sold its supplementary licence. When it was pointed out to the New South Wales minister that maybe you just spent a lot of taxpayers' money buying air, he said, but Tandao's doing it tough at the moment. So it really not addressing the rudimentary issue of over-allocation. In another incident, you might think about a thing called Tarowley Station. Tarowley Station was in the news a year or so ago when Penny Wong decided that she would buy Tarowley Station when it came to the market. Tarowley Station is located upstream of Menindee Lakes. If you look at the DEWA reports for the year of that purchase, DEWA was recommending that no water should be purchased upstream of Menindee because, like Cubby Station, it's primarily supplementary flow water or high volume water. You can only draw it out when the river reaches a certain level. So when you buy that water and leave it in the river, it just means the person next door draws it out. So buying water in those sorts of areas will not deliver water at the end of the catchment. It just provides a benefit to somebody next door. Now, once we start talking about politics, we can't, of course, avoid interstate rivalries. We know that in this state, for example, the Victorian government decided that buyback sounds okay, but we're only going to let 4% in an irrigation district leave and be purchased by somebody else. So they capped it at 4%. Now think about what that means. It means that if you're at the front of the queue selling your water, willingly selling your water, trying to get out of irrigation, if you're at the front of the queue, you get to sell into a competitive market where the federal government's a keen bidder. But once you get a little bit further down the queue, you're not allowed to sell outside the district. You might need to sell that water. You might need to get out of that district, which basically means who are you going to sell to? You're most likely to sell to, of course, the richer, the more affluent, the more successful farmer. Now, I find it curious that the Victorian government would argue that they've developed this policy with a view to try and help communities adjust. I would have thought helping rich irrigators do over their next door neighbour who's not doing so well hardly sort of lines up with my general sense of what social justice is about. Now, not to be outdone, of course, now the New South Wales government has embargoed all water sales. So New South Wales government has reacted by saying, well, we're not selling any more water to the government. They forgot to tell those farmers at Deniliquin that had $12 million worth of sales on the table that they were going to do this. So the farmers that had decided to sell this water were going to use that money to plant a dryland crop or to finance the dryland crop that they'd already planted. And now, of course, the government's decided that that's not going to go ahead. It's interesting. Where there is some hope, we have the Productivity Commission who has decided that this is worth looking into, and I would encourage you all to go to their site and have a look at some of the submissions where there is a more detailed analysis by myself and others of some of the problems with this. I just want to take the last 5 minutes to talk about something that I really dislike. You thought I disliked buyback? Try this. This is the second option. The second option, of course, is to basically subsidise irrigation infrastructure. Now, I live in southern New South Wales, but I work in northern Victoria, obviously, so I got this in my letterbox. This is a brochure promoting the Northern Food Bowl Modernisation Project. Students in the audience, have a read of that. See if you would like to put that on your essay next time you hand it in. This publication may be of assistance to you, but the State of Victoria and its employees do not guarantee that the publication is without flaw of any kind or is wholly appropriate for your particular purpose, and therefore disclaims all liability for any error, loss or other consequence which may arise from you relying on any information in this publication. I don't think we would accept that on students' essays when they hand it in. And yet this is on a public document. What it really means is we've had this idea. We haven't quite got around to doing the numbers, but we've put some together anyway. Under pressure about the rubberiness of these numbers, including from the Auditor-General of this state, the Minister for Water, Tim Holding, has reassured us, and I'm feeling so much reassured now, because he's brought out some protocols by which we will robustly verify and audit the water savings that are purportedly occurring. So here's the document. So if you can't sleep at night, go to the web, find this document on DSC and have a read. Before you read it, ask yourself the question, where was the water going before? And if you get to the end of the document and you have successfully answered that question, you are better than me. Because the basic problem with this is that there is no accounting for where the water has gone. When water leaks from an irrigation system, it generally does not go to Mars. It usually goes somewhere else, quite often to an aquifer, quite often to support some flow elsewhere, or possibly even to somebody who already had an entitlement to it. So in effect, you're not creating water, you're not saving water, you're redistributing water in time and space, usually at a cost to somebody else. So my problems with subsidising irrigation in order to get this thing back into balance really fall into three groups. The first one is cost. If you think about it, we brought a market in, we allowed farmers to trade. So farmers are pretty rational people, but most of them are rational economic man or woman. And so what they did was they invested sensibly in infrastructure that would save them water, which could then be sold. But they didn't go beyond that point. They didn't go to the point of spending billions of your dollars, because they didn't have it then. They didn't go to the point of spending billions of dollars in order to save something that had a very low monetary return. So all that was left, really, by the time the government got to these projects were the things that weren't worth doing. The second problem, of course, is hydrology, which I've explained, and the third problem I have with this is that most of it is calculated on averages. This thing called LTCE stands for long-term cap equivalence. It's the average flow for the last 115 years. Now, those of you doing finance would know about time series type stuff. Averages generally not much chop. As one of my colleagues once says, the average Australian has one breast and one testicle. Not particularly enlightening when you think about it. Not particularly enlightening when you think about it. But basing things on averages is a problem. You need to think more seriously about perhaps the trends, and the more recent trends you probably would weight more heavily than the trends of 110 years ago. So if you're interested in this, I do suggest you look up a guy called Chris Perry. You'll find his articles on the web. Chris Perry used to work for the International Water Management Institute, and he, like me, is a passionate disbeliever of the water use efficiency argument. That, for example, there are studies in Egypt that show when you measure water use efficiency at the farm level, you get about 45%. When you measure it at the catchment level, you get about 90%. So if you tighten up on an irrigation district, all you're doing is stopping the water flowing to somebody else who previously expected it arriving. Now, just to wrap up, my problem with these two policy approaches together then is that they don't work. So on the one hand, we're out there trying to buy water back to restore a balance, and on the other hand, we're out there subsidising projects in irrigation districts to tighten up and purportedly make them more water use efficient. What we know is that when you invest money in an irrigation district, that will raise the marginal product of water in that district. I know that's complex for non-economists, but basically what it's going to do is it's going to push up the demand for water in those districts. If you're outside the district, you're going to discover that your water's not quite as reliable as it was. So the only way that you can stay in production is to go back into the market and buy more water. So you are bidding up the price of water as a result. Now, if you were the government trying to buy back water, surely you'd be thinking about value for money, because that's written all over their publications. And value for money means getting as much water of the best possible quality, of the best possible reliability, for the least amount of public expenditure. Of course, what we're doing is we're making sure that we don't achieve that. We're making sure, in fact, that we end up with water products of very low reliability to service the environment, and we spend a lot more money than we otherwise should have had to. For me, the solutions, they're not easy because we're actually dealing with water politics. So Homo economicus does eventually run into water politics and it becomes problematic. In the short term, it would be really nice if we could go back to 1994 to 2004 and force people to be accountable for public funding of projects. Governments will say that there is this due diligence process. My problem is that once a minister commits to something and then decides to undertake due diligence, you can usually be assured the due diligence will fall favourably for the minister. So it's kind of a little out of whack. In the longer term, I hope that forums like this, we can reshape the debate and we can think about our spending of our public dollars and whether it makes sense, and ask our politicians to be somewhat more accountable. It would be also really useful if some of the literature about the great benefits that attend buyback was to be more broadly accepted. For example, in the US, many of the most successful farming districts are those that have options contracts with places like Los Angeles, where ostensibly they sell their water when there's a drought, they go on holidays and then they come back and start again. All that means, of course, you need annual cropping, not permanent cropping, which the Victorian government says is the future. So in summing up, there are pretty standard answers to this from economics. That is, allocating resources with markets will generally do a pretty good job. If you are concerned about regional communities and the adjustment processes being too swift, the appropriate response is not to fiddle with the allocation of resource, not to impose rules about who's going to get water, but to let the market do that and then use the wealth and income generated to deal with your concerns on the social front. The political challenges are quite tricky, as you no doubt realise living in Bendigo, but I don't think they're completely insurmountable. So if you have questions, now's the chance to tear into me.